The autumn leaves fell like copper coins against the windows of Thornfield House, a modest estate that had become Eleanor Ashworth's sanctuary over the course of 20 years. She sat in the drawing room, a book resting forgotten in her lap, watching the afternoon light filter through the amber and crimson canopy outside. At 38, Lady Eleanor had cultivated a life of quiet dignity, a life built not from the ashes of her dreams, but carefully constructed from different materials altogether. The woman she had become bore little resemblance to the hopeful girl of 18 who had once believed that an arranged marriage might blossom into something beautiful. That girl had been crushed beneath the weight of public rejection, her heart shattered in a ballroom filled with pitying glances and whispered gossip. But the woman who remained had learned to find peace in solitude, purpose in charity work, and contentment in the steady rhythm of days unmarked by scandal or heartbreak. When her companion, Mrs. Hartley, entered the room carrying the afternoon post on a silver tray, Eleanor barely glanced up. It was only when the older woman cleared her throat with peculiar insistence that Eleanor set aside her book and reached for the cream-colored envelope that lay atop the pile. The seal made her fingers still. The Duke of Ravensmere's crest, a raven in flight above a shield, was unmistakable, pressed into dark blue wax. Her heart performed a strange, traitorous flutter before she commanded it to stillness. The Duke of Ravensmere, Alexander Ashford, the man who had looked at her 20 years ago with such cold disdain, who had called off their engagement with words that still sometimes echoed in the hollow spaces of her memory. I cannot bind myself to someone so thoroughly unsuitable. Eleanor broke the seal with steady hands. She had learned steadiness, if nothing else, and read the elegant script inviting her to a grand ball at Ravensmere Hall. The date was set for 3 weeks hence. No personal note accompanied the formal invitation, no acknowledgement of their shared painful history. She wondered if he even remembered her, or if she was simply one name among hundreds on his guest list, a minor member of the gentry whose presence would add numbers to his gathering. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, she felt a strange, uncomfortable stirring, not of the old pain, which had long since scarred over, but of something she could not quite name. "My lady?" Mrs. Hartley ventured carefully. "Will you accept?" Eleanor looked again at the invitation, at the careful calligraphy and the expensive paper. 20 years. She had built a good life, a peaceful life. She owed Alexander Ashford nothing, not her presence, not her forgiveness, not even her acknowledgement. And yet, yes, she heard herself say, surprising them both. "I believe I will, but before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. Now, let's begin." 20 years ago, Eleanor Hastings had been a different creature entirely, a girl of 18 with rose-colored hopes and a heart that still believed in fairy tales, even those arranged by solicitors and signed with her father's hurried hand. She had prepared for her first meeting with the Duke of Ravensmere as though preparing for salvation itself, her maid lacing her into a gown of pale blue silk, while her mother fussed over every curl, every ribbon, every detail that might make her acceptable to the man who would become her husband. The girl in the mirror had looked back at her with nervous eyes, practicing smiles that she hoped might appear demure rather than desperate. When she had entered the drawing-room of her father's London townhouse that April morning, Alexander Ashford had been standing by the window, his back to the door, his posture rigid with what she would later understand was resentment. He had turned at her entrance, and she had felt the weight of his gaze like winter frost cold, assessing and utterly dismissive. He was handsome, certainly, with dark hair and aristocratic features that belonged on a Greek statue, but his eyes held no warmth, no curiosity, nothing that suggested he saw her as anything more than an inconvenient obligation. Their conversation had been stilted, formal, a recitation of pleasantries that fooled no one. She had tried, oh how she had tried to engage him, asking careful questions about his estate, his interests, his travels. He had answered in monosyllables, his attention drifting constantly toward the window, toward anywhere but her face. When he took his leave after precisely 30 minutes, he had bowed with mechanical courtesy and departed without a single word of reassurance or kindness. But it was the betrothal ball, 3 weeks later, that had destroyed her. The ballroom at Ravensmere Hall had been magnificent, filled with the cream of society, all assembled to celebrate the forthcoming union of the Duke and Miss Eleanor Hastings. She had worn white, as her mother insisted, with pearls at her throat, a lamb dressed for slaughter, though she hadn't known it then. Alexander had led her onto the floor for the first waltz, his hand at her waist as impersonal as a stranger's, his face carved from marble. Midway through the dance he had stopped, simply stopped, there in the center of the ballroom, while the music continued and 300 pairs of eyes turned toward them. "I cannot do this," he had said, his voice carrying in the sudden hush. "I cannot bind myself to someone so thoroughly unsuitable. This engagement is ended." He had released her as though she burned him, turned on his heel, and walked from his own ballroom, leaving her standing alone beneath the chandeliers, while shock rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Eleanor had not cried, not then, not in front of them all. She had stood frozen, her hands still positioned as though she were dancing with a ghost, while the whispers grew louder and her mother's wail of dismay echoed from somewhere behind her. The humiliation had been absolute, a public execution of her worth as a woman, as a person. She had been found unsuitable, and everyone had witnessed her rejection. The evening settled over Thornfield House with the weight of unspoken things, and Eleanor found herself unable to settle with it. She moved restlessly through the familiar rooms, the library where she had read 1,000 books, the music room where her pianoforte sat silent, the conservatory where winter roses bloomed in defiance of the season. The invitation lay on the escritoire in her study, that cream-colored rectangle of expensive paper that somehow managed to disrupt the careful equilibrium of her existence. Mrs. Hartley found her there an hour past dinner, standing at the window with her arms wrapped around herself, as though warding off a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The older woman, who had been companion and confidant for 15 years, approached with the directness that their friendship permitted. "You should not go," she said without preamble. "You have built a good life here, my lady. You owe that man nothing, not your presence, not your time, certainly not the reopening of old wounds." Eleanor turned from the window, managing a small smile. "I know. Then why are you considering it?" It was the question Eleanor had been asking herself for hours, circling it like a wolf circles a trap, wary and uncertain. Why did the invitation disturb her so? She had long since made peace with her past, or so she had believed. The girl who had been humiliated in that ballroom had died, in a sense, and from her ashes had risen someone stronger, someone who did not need validation from society or affection from men who could not see her worth. She had friends, modest wealth, purpose in her charitable endeavors. She was content, and yet, "I thought I had moved beyond it," Eleanor said quietly, her fingers tracing the window frame. "Beyond him, beyond that night, beyond all of it. But the moment I saw that seal, I felt something, not the old pain, exactly, but its ghost, a tremor in ground I believed solid." Mrs. Hartley's expression softened with understanding. "Old wounds may heal, my dear, but the scars remain. It does not mean you have failed in your recovery. It means you are human." Eleanor nodded slowly, turning the thought over in her mind like a stone polished smooth by years of water. She had healed, yes. She had built a life of dignity and purpose, but perhaps there was a difference between healing and truly being free. Perhaps some part of her still stood in that ballroom, frozen in humiliation, waiting for permission to leave. "I think I must go," she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "Not for him, I care nothing for Alexander Ashford's opinion of me now, but for myself. To prove to myself that I can stand in that place, in his presence, and feel nothing but indifference. To know that the girl who was broken there no longer exists, that she has been replaced entirely by the woman I have become." Mrs. Hartley studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then you shall go with your head high and your heart armored, and I shall help you choose a gown that makes it clear you have not spent 20 years pining for a man too foolish to recognize treasure when it stood before him." Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "Yes," she agreed, "let us do exactly that." The 3 weeks before the ball passed in a strange suspension of time, and Eleanor found herself reflecting on the years that had transformed her from that devastated girl into the woman she had become. The change had not been sudden or dramatic, but rather accumulated through countless small decisions, each one a step away from the person she might have been if Alexander Ashford had not rejected her. In the immediate aftermath of that terrible night, she had retreated to her father's country estate, nursing her wounds in solitude. But solitude, she discovered, need not mean stagnation. While other young women of her acquaintance were navigating the marriage market, Eleanor had turned to books with the hunger of the shipwrecked reaching for driftwood. Philosophy, literature, history, science, she had devoured them all, her mind expanding into territories that polite society deemed unnecessary for women. She had learned French and Italian, not from a governess's careful lessons, but from immersion during modest travels through the continent with a widowed aunt who believed that disappointment in love was no reason to disappoint oneself in life. She had walked through the museums of Paris, the libraries of Florence, the ancient streets of Rome, and with each step she had shed another layer of the shame that had threatened to define her. Upon her return to England, she had discovered purpose in work that mattered, establishing a school for daughters of impoverished gentlewomen, funding a charitable hospital, advocating quietly but persistently for reforms that might ease the suffering of those without her advantages. She had learned that significance need not come from a husband's status, that a woman's worth could be measured in the lives she touched, the minds she nurtured, the injustices she worked to remedy. Now, standing before the wardrobe in her dressing room as Mrs. Hartley laid out options for the ball, Eleanor saw the physical manifestation of her internal transformation. The gowns before her were elegant but not ostentatious, fashionable but not desperate to impress. She passed over the pale colors that had been forced upon her in her youth, those insipid blues and pinks meant to suggest innocence and malleability. Her hand settled instead on a gown of deep emerald silk, the color rich and dignified, with elegant lines that flattered her figure without attempting to recapture youth she no longer possessed or desired. The dress was cut in the latest fashion, but with a classical simplicity that spoke of confidence rather than decoration. "Yes, Mrs." Hartley said approvingly. "That one says everything that needs saying." Eleanor studied her reflection as the gown was fitted. Noting the ways time had marked her, the fine lines at her eyes from years of reading by lamplight, the silver threading through her chestnut hair that she refused to hide with dyes, the calm assurance in her posture that came from knowing one's own worth independent of others' validation. She was no longer beautiful in the dewy, uncertain way of 18. She was something better, striking, self-possessed, substantial. The jewels she chose were simple, a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, and emerald earrings she had purchased herself in Venice with money from her own investments. Every element of her appearance would declare a truth. She was not the girl he had rejected, seeking redemption or revenge. She was simply herself, complete and content, granting him a few hours of her valuable time before returning to a life that held meaning without him. Alexander Ashford, Duke of Ravensmere, stood in the portrait gallery of his ancestral home, studying the face of his late wife as rendered by a fashionable artist 7 years before her death. Catherine stared back at him with the same polite indifference she had shown him throughout their 15-year marriage, beautiful, proper, and utterly distant. She had been everything society demanded a duchess should be, impeccably bred, flawlessly mannered, politically advantageous. She had also been profoundly unhappy, as had he, though neither of them possessed the courage or vocabulary to name their mutual misery until it was far too late. She had died 2 years ago of a fever that took her quickly, and Alexander had mourned not the woman herself, whom he had never truly known, but the waste of it all, the years spent in careful civility that masked a fundamental emptiness. At 42, he found himself the master of a vast estate, possessed of considerable wealth and influence, and utterly alone in ways that had nothing to do with the absence of company. The loneliness was existential, a recognition that he had built his entire life on foundations of pride and prejudice, and that the structure was crumbling beneath him. The realization of his own cruelty had come gradually, accumulated through sleepless nights and solitary days when there was no one left to perform for, no role to play. He thought often of Eleanor Hastings, no, Eleanor Ashworth, as she was now, having inherited a modest estate from a distant relation. He thought of the girl he had rejected with such callous certainty, convinced in his youthful arrogance that he deserved better, that she was somehow beneath him because her dowry was modest and her conversation nervous and her background insufficiently illustrious. What a fool he had been! What a cruel, stupid fool! He had married for advantage and lived to regret it every day of his cold, correct marriage. He had rejected genuine feeling in favor of strategic alliance, and the cost had been 2 decades of emotional desolation, Not just his own, but Catherine's, and most unforgivably, Eleanor's. The girl whose only crime had been hoping that an arranged marriage might contain some kindness, some possibility of affection. He had humiliated her publicly, destroyed her socially, and never once apologized or acknowledged the magnitude of his cruelty. The idea of the ball had come to him 3 months ago, emerging from the fog of his melancholy, like a desperate grasp at redemption he had no right to seek. He told himself it was merely a social obligation, a gesture to re-engage with society after his period of mourning. But when his secretary presented the guest list, Alexander had scanned it with trembling fingers until he found her name, and then he had written it in himself with careful script, ensuring the invitation would be sent. He did not examine too closely why it mattered so much that Eleanor Ashworth attend. He told himself he merely wished to see that she had fared well, that his cruelty had not permanently destroyed her. But in the darkest hours of night, when honesty was unavoidable, he knew the truth. He wanted to see her again because she represented the road not taken, the choice he had been too proud and too foolish to make, and some pathetic part of him hoped that seeing her might ease the regret that had become his constant companion. The ballroom at Ravensmere Hall blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers until the entire space seemed to shimmer like something from a dream. Alexander stood near the grand staircase, greeting guests with mechanical courtesy, his attention fractured and wandering despite his best efforts at composure. He had been watching for her all evening, though he would not admit it even to himself, his gaze drawn repeatedly to the entrance, as though magnetized by expectation and dread in equal measure. When Eleanor Ashworth appeared at the top of the stairs, the world seemed to perform some impossible trick of perception, narrowing until there was only her, only that moment, only the breath that caught in his throat like something sharp and unexpected. She was not the girl he remembered. That trembling creature in pale blue silk had been replaced entirely by a woman who moved with the self-possession of one who had learned her own worth in the hardest of schools. The emerald gown she wore was elegant, without ostentation, rich without desperation, and it complemented rather than competed with the quiet dignity she radiated like light from within. Her hair, shot through with silver she made no attempt to hide, was arranged in a style that was fashionable yet timeless. But it was her bearing that struck him most profoundly, the way she descended the stairs with her head high, the calm assurance in her movements, the complete absence of the nervous, pleading hope that had characterized her youth. She had become magnificent, and he had missed it entirely, had forfeited any right to witness her transformation. Alexander found himself frozen, unable to move or speak, barely able to breathe as she crossed the ballroom floor, pausing to greet acquaintances with warmth that seemed utterly genuine. She laughed at something an elderly countess said, the sound carrying across the space like music he had forgotten existed, and he felt the loss of her, the staggering waste of what might have been settled over him like a physical weight. It was then that her gaze swept the room and found him. For one endless moment, their eyes met across the distance of 20 years and 40 feet of polished marble floor, and Alexander saw in her expression something that devastated him more completely than anger or pain ever could have: indifference. She looked at him the way one might look at a piece of furniture barely remembered from childhood, with mild recognition and no particular feeling whatsoever. He had hoped, in the secret chambers of his foolish heart, that seeing him might provoke some reaction, some evidence that he had mattered enough to leave a mark. But there was nothing. She inclined her head with perfect politeness, a gesture that acknowledged his status as host and nothing more, and then her attention moved on as though he were no more significant than any other fixture in the room. The realization crashed over him with the force of revelation. He had destroyed something precious 20 years ago, and she had survived his destruction, rebuilt herself into something stronger and finer than she had been, and done it all without him, without needing his approval or validation or even his acknowledgement. She had moved beyond him so completely that his presence meant nothing to her now, and that recognition, that overwhelming understanding of what he had lost through his own cruelty and pride, was more painful than anything he had ever experienced. Alexander waited a quarter hour before approaching her, though it felt like an eternity measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths. He found her near the terrace doors, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman, her profile serene in the candlelight. He had rehearsed a dozen opening lines, discarded them all, and now found himself walking toward her with nothing prepared but a desperate hope that the right words might somehow present themselves when needed. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice emerging rougher than intended, "I am honored that you accepted my invitation." She turned to face him with a composure that seemed almost preternatural, her expression pleasant and entirely impenetrable. "Your Grace," she replied, executing a curtsy that was correct in every degree and utterly devoid of warmth. "You have a lovely gathering. Ravensmere Hall is as magnificent as I remember." The words were perfectly chosen, perfectly delivered, and perfectly meaningless, the verbal equivalent of a wall constructed of politeness and indifference. Alexander felt something twist in his chest, a pain that was part panic and part grief, as he recognized the complete absence of any real engagement in her manner. She was being cordial in the way one was cordial to strangers at social functions, with no acknowledgement of their shared history, no indication that he had once meant anything to her at all. He began, then faltered, uncertain how to proceed. What could he possibly say? That he had thought of her often over the years? That he regretted everything? Such confessions were inappropriate here, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, and more importantly, they were clearly unwelcome. She waited with patient courtesy for him to complete his thought, her eyes meeting his with calm disinterest. "I hope you have been well," he finished lamely, the words inadequate and insipid even to his own ears. "Quite well, thank you," Eleanor replied, her tone suggesting she might be discussing the weather with a tedious acquaintance. "I keep myself occupied with various charitable endeavors. One finds purpose in service to others, I have discovered." There was no accusation in her words, no pointed reminder that he had once found her lacking in every quality that mattered. She was simply making conversation, filling the silence with acceptable pleasantries, while her real thoughts remained locked away behind walls he had no means of breaching. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions about her life, her happiness, whether she had found someone worthy of her, whether she had forgiven him, but her demeanor forbade such intimacy. She had granted him nothing but surface courtesy, and it was clear she intended to grant him nothing more. "I am glad to hear it," Alexander managed, feeling the conversation dying beneath the weight of all the things he could not say. "Yes, well," Eleanor said, glancing past him toward the ballroom with a slight smile that did not reach her eyes. "I see Lady Pemberton beckoning to me. If you will excuse me, Your Grace, I should pay my respects. Thank you for your hospitality this evening." She curtsied again, that same perfect, empty gesture, and moved past him with a grace that suggested she had already forgotten he existed. Alexander stood motionless, watching her glide away into the crowd, her emerald gown disappearing among the other guests, like a jewel returned to a collection where it had always belonged. The devastation he felt was absolute and surprising in its intensity. He had thought, in some foolish corner of his mind, that seeing her might provide an opportunity for reconciliation, or at least acknowledgement. But she felt nothing for him, not anger, not pain, not even curiosity. He had been erased from her emotional landscape as thoroughly as yesterday's rain, and the emptiness where his significance to her might once have existed was more crushing than any hatred could have been. Alexander could not stop watching her. He moved through the evening's obligations like an automaton dancing with the required partners, exchanging pleasantries with important guests, playing the role of gracious host, but his attention remained fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He told himself he was simply curious about how she had fared, but the truth was darker and more desperate. He was studying her the way a starving man might study a feast he had once refused, trying to understand the magnitude of his own foolishness. He watched her speak with Lord and Lady Pemberton, her manner warm but not obsequious, engaging them with questions about their recently married daughter that displayed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Lady Pemberton, notoriously difficult to please, actually laughed at something Eleanor said, her face transforming with delight. He watched her encounter a nervous young woman who stood alone near the refreshment table, clearly overwhelmed by the grandeur of the gathering. Eleanor approached her with the ease of long practice, drawing her into conversation with such skillful gentleness that within minutes the girl was smiling, her shoulders relaxing from their hunched anxiety. It was an act of kindness, performed without audience or expectation of recognition, the sort of casual grace that spoke to character rather than performance. He watched her debate some point of literature with Lord Ashton, a noted scholar, and saw the older man's expression shift from patronizing courtesy to genuine engagement, as he recognized the depth of her knowledge and the sharpness of her intellect. She spoke with confidence but without arrogance, challenging his interpretation of a particular text with arguments that were both respectful and persuasive. When had she become so learned, so articulate? Had she always possessed such intelligence, and he had simply been too blind and too prejudiced to see it? He watched her refuse a dance with a widower known for his wandering hands, her rejection delivered with such diplomatic firmness that the man retreated without offense. Understanding that this was a woman who knew her worth and would not compromise it for the sake of avoiding awkwardness, she commanded respect without demanding it, wielded her dignity like a shield that required no weapon behind it. Every interaction, every gesture, every word revealed dimensions to her character that 20 years ago he had never bothered to discover. He had looked at her nervous 18-year-old self and seen only inadequacy, modest dowry, provincial background, trembling disposition. He had never looked deeper, never wondered what thoughts moved behind her anxious eyes, never considered that her nervousness might have been the natural result of meeting a man who regarded her with obvious disdain. He had judged her unsuitable and discarded her like damaged goods, and in doing so, he had rejected the possibility of knowing this woman, this kind, intelligent, dignified woman who moved through his ballroom like a queen among courtiers, needing nothing from anyone because she had learned to be sufficient unto herself. The regret that settled over him was not the sharp pain of a fresh wound, but the deep, chronic ache of a bone badly set, something that would never heal properly, that would trouble him for the rest of his days. Across the room, Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, and turned to find him staring at her once again. Something flickered across her face, not fear, precisely, but a kind of wary discomfort, as though his attention was an intrusion she had not anticipated and did not welcome. She looked away quickly, her conversation with her companions continuing without interruption, but her posture had shifted subtly, her awareness of his presence coloring her ease with something that looked dangerously close to disturbance. The ballroom had grown stifling, the press of bodies and the weight of Alexander's constant observation combining to make the air feel thick and unbreathable. Eleanor excused herself from her companions with a murmured word about needing fresh air and slipped through the terrace doors into the garden beyond, grateful for the cool embrace of the October night. The garden at Ravensmere Hall was extensive and formal, laid out in geometric patterns that spoke to an earlier century's love of order imposed upon nature. Eleanor walked along a gravel path, her slippers crunching softly, until she reached a stone bench beneath an arbor where the last roses of the season clung stubbornly to life despite the approaching frost. She sat, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, and allowed herself a moment of honest feeling the disquiet that had been building all evening as she felt his eyes following her movements, studying her as though she were a puzzle he needed to solve. She had come here to prove her indifference, to demonstrate that she had moved beyond the past, but his attention unsettled her in ways she could not quite name, stirring something she had thought long buried. "Lady Ashworth," his voice came from behind her, and she started despite herself, turning to find Alexander standing at the edge of the path, his figure half in shadow. He must have followed her from the ballroom, abandoning his own guests to pursue her into the darkness. The impropriety of it would have scandalized society, but they were alone here, and Eleanor felt more annoyed than concerned. "Your Grace," she said, rising from the bench with deliberate composure, "you should return to your guests. They will notice your absence." "Let them notice," he said, moving closer, and she saw in the moonlight that his face was drawn with some emotion. She could not decipher anguish, perhaps, or desperation. "I must speak with you. I need to apologize." Eleanor felt her heart perform a strange, painful contraction. "That is unnecessary," she said quietly. "Please, let me." He moved toward her with sudden urgency, his hands raised as though to grasp hers, then falling back to his sides as though he had no right to touch her. "What I did to you 20 years ago was unforgivable. I was cruel and arrogant and blind. I rejected you because I thought I believed I deserved better, that you were somehow beneath me. I have lived to regret that decision every day of my marriage, every day of my life since." The words tumbled out of him in a rush, clumsy and inadequate, the confession of a man who had rehearsed nothing and was now simply bleeding truth into the darkness. Eleanor listened with a face that betrayed nothing, though something in her chest tightened painfully at the rawness in his voice. When he finished, she drew a slow breath and met his eyes with steady calm. "I appreciate your apology, Your Grace," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Truly, I do. But the past is past. I have made my peace with what happened between us. I harbor no ill will toward you, no lingering anger or pain. What you did hurt me terribly at the time, yes. It nearly destroyed me, but I survived it, and in many ways I became stronger for it. I built a good life, a meaningful life, and I am content with what I have become." "Eleanor," he began, using her given name for the first time, and she raised a hand to stop him. "I forgive you," she said simply. "If that is what you need to hear, then hear it. I forgive you, but forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. It does not mean I have any interest in revisiting the past or exploring what might have been. That door closed 20 years ago, and I have moved beyond it." She gathered her shawl and moved to step past him, back toward the ballroom and the life she had built without him. "No." The word came from Alexander like something torn from his chest, and before Eleanor could process what was happening, he had dropped to his knees before her on the gravel path, his head bowed, his entire body trembling with the force of emotions he could no longer contain. "Please, Eleanor, please do not leave like this. I cannot bear your kindness, your forgiveness offered like alms to a beggar who deserves nothing. You do not understand what I have done to myself, what I have lost." Eleanor froze, shocked into immobility by the sight of the Duke of Ravensmere kneeling before her like a penitent in a medieval painting. This was not done. Men of his station did not kneel to anyone save the king, and certainly not to women they had wronged decades past. The impropriety of it, the sheer abandonment of dignity, spoke to a desperation that was almost frightening in its intensity. "Your Grace, please rise," she said, her voice unsteady despite her efforts at composure. "This is not, you must not—" "I married for advantage," he continued, as though she had not spoken. His words spilling forth in a torrent, he seemed powerless to stop. "I rejected you because your dowry was modest, because your connections were insufficient, because in my arrogance I believed I deserved a duchess who would elevate my position rather than simply share my life. I married Catherine Blackwood, whose father was a marquis and whose fortune was substantial, and I spent 15 years in a marriage so cold, so empty, and so devoid of any genuine feeling that I often wondered if I had died and been consigned to some special circle of hell reserved for fools who mistake status for happiness." His voice broke on the last word, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack, despite her determination to remain unmoved. "We were strangers who shared a house," he went on, his hands clenched into fists against his thighs. "We performed our duties, produced no heirs, and spoke to each other with the distant courtesy of diplomats from warring nations. She was as miserable as I was, though we never spoke of it. And every day, every single day, I thought of you, of the girl I had rejected, of the cruelty I had inflicted, of the choice I had made that destroyed any possibility of happiness for myself or for her. I thought of your face as I walked away from you in that ballroom, and I knew even then that I was making the worst mistake of my life. But I was too proud, too stupid, too committed to my own sense of superiority to turn back." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, moved despite herself by the raw anguish in his confession. This was not the cold, disdainful young man who had rejected her. This was someone broken by his own choices, haunted by regret, suffering in ways she had never imagined. "Alexander," she whispered, using his name without thinking. "Please stand up." "I do not deserve your forgiveness," he said, looking up at her finally, and she saw that his face was wet with tears he made no attempt to hide. "I do not deserve your kindness or your understanding. I destroyed you, and I destroyed myself, and I have spent 20 years living in the wreckage of my own pride. But if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, truly forgive me, not with the distant charity you offered a moment ago, but with real understanding, it might ease the burden of guilt that has become my constant companion." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a softening she had not anticipated and did not entirely welcome. She reached down, placing her hands on his arms, urging him gently to rise. "Come," she said quietly, "stand up. This is not proper, and you will regret this display when you are calmer. He rose unsteadily, and she steadied him with her hands, shocked by the intimacy of the contact after so many years. They stood facing each other in the moonlight, close enough that she could see the lines grief and regret had carved into his face. "I do forgive you," she said, her voice firmer now, though not unkind. "I forgive you completely and without reservation. What you did was cruel, but you were young and foolish, and you have clearly punished yourself far more thoroughly than I ever could. But Alexander, you must understand forgiveness does not erase the past. It does not restore what was lost or create possibilities that no longer exist. I have built a life without you, and it is a good life. I do not need you to complete it, and I have no wish to revisit dreams that died 20 years ago." She released his arms and stepped back, creating distance between them once more. "Find your peace," she said gently, "but find it in accepting what cannot be changed, not in trying to reclaim what you rejected." And with that, she turned and walked back toward the ballroom, leaving him standing alone in the garden with the weight of his regrets and the echo of her footsteps fading into the night. The days following the ball stretched into weeks, and Alexander found himself unable to return to the numb equilibrium that had characterized his existence before Eleanor Ashworth walked back into his life. She haunted him not as a ghost of guilt, though that remained, but as a presence that had awakened something he thought long dead, some capacity for longing he had believed his cold marriage had extinguished entirely. He sat in his study night after night, attempting to compose a letter that might somehow bridge the chasm between them, might express what he felt without imposing demands she had made clear she would not welcome. The first letter took him 3 hours and 7 false starts before he managed something that felt honest without being pathetic, apologetic without being self-pitying. He wrote of how her grace and dignity at the ball had moved him, how seeing what she had become made him recognize the full measure of what he had lost. He did not ask for anything, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not even a response. He simply told her that knowing she had found happiness and purpose, despite his cruelty, had brought him a kind of peace he had not known he needed. He sent it with no expectation of reply, and received none. A week later, he wrote again, this time about a book of philosophy he thought might interest her, based on a comment he had overheard her make to Lord Ashton. He included no personal reflections, no references to their shared past, simply a thoughtful engagement with ideas he believed might spark her interest. Again, silence. He did not stop. Every week, a letter arrived at Thornfield House, never demanding, never desperate, but thoughtful and genuine. He wrote about art he had seen, ideas he was grappling with, questions of ethics and meaning that occupied his increasingly introspective mind. He wrote as though they were friends engaged in intellectual discourse, creating a conversation even though only one voice was speaking. Eleanor never responded, but neither did she return the letters unopened, and Alexander took what small comfort he could from that ambiguous mercy. He made inquiries discreet, careful about her charitable work, and discovered she had founded a school for impoverished gentlewomen's daughters and supported a hospital that served the poor without regard to their ability to pay. He sent substantial anonymous donations to both institutions, wanting to support work that mattered to her without demanding recognition or gratitude. When his secretary questioned the expenditures, Alexander simply said they were worthy causes, which was true, even if his motivations were more complicated than pure philanthropy. He began appearing at social events he would normally have avoided, small gatherings, literary salons, charity benefits, because he knew she frequented such affairs. He made no attempt to corner her or force conversation, but simply existed in her orbit, letting her see through his presence and his choices that he had changed, that the arrogant young duke, who had valued status above substance, no longer existed. At a benefit for orphaned children, he saw her across the room speaking with the organizers, her face animated with passion for the cause. She glanced up, found him watching, and something flickered in her expression, not warmth, precisely, but perhaps a softening of her previous complete indifference, a recognition that his persistence was not predatory but genuine. She did not approach him, and he did not approach her, but for a moment their eyes held, and he felt the faintest spark of possibility, fragile as a candle flame in wind. Eleanor stood at her writing desk, staring at the latest letter from Alexander Ashford, as though it were a serpent that might strike if she looked away. It lay atop a stack of 6 others, all unopened initially, though she had eventually succumbed to curiosity and read each one with a mixture of irritation and something she refused to name. This week's missive discussed a translation of Marcus Aurelius he thought might interest her, included thoughtful marginalia on the nature of forgiveness and self-transformation, and made no mention whatsoever of their personal history. It was exactly the sort of intellectual engagement she might have enjoyed from any other correspondent, which was precisely what made it so unsettling. "You should burn them, Mrs." Hartley said from the doorway, having observed Eleanor's troubled contemplation for the better part of 10 minutes. "All of them. Make it clear you will not be pursued, even gently." Eleanor looked up, grateful for the interruption to her spiraling thoughts. "I know I should. I know that encouraging any correspondence, even through silent acceptance, is unwise. But they are not demanding anything, Margaret. They are simply thoughtful, intelligent, the letters of someone who has perhaps genuinely changed, or the letters of someone who has learned to disguise manipulation as intellectual discourse, Mrs." Hartley countered, moving into the room and taking the chair opposite Eleanor's desk. "My dear, you owe him nothing. Not your attention, not your consideration. Certainly not the reopening of doors you closed for excellent reasons." "I know," Eleanor said, but even as she spoke, she felt the inadequacy of her conviction. She did know, intellectually, that she should cease all contact, return the letters unopened, make her disinterest abundantly clear. But something had shifted that night in the garden when she saw him on his knees before her, broken and weeping, bearing the weight of regrets that had clearly hollowed him out from within. That had not been the arrogant young duke of her memory. That had been a man genuinely suffering, genuinely transformed by his own cruelty into something humbled and aware. "He has been making donations to your charities, Mrs." Hartley continued, clearly determined to press her point. "Substantial ones, anonymous, but his secretary's inquiries were noted. And he appears at every event you attend, always watching, always present. This is a campaign, Eleanor, however gentle its execution." Eleanor felt a flush of anger at this intelligence, not at Alexander, strangely, but at her own traitorous response to it. The donations proved nothing except wealth, and perhaps a desire to support causes that mattered to her. His presence at social events proved nothing except a willingness to engage with society he had previously avoided. And yet her heart insisted on interpreting these gestures as evidence of genuine transformation, of a man trying desperately to demonstrate through actions, rather than words, that he had become someone worthy of her consideration. She found herself thinking of him at odd moments while reading, while walking in her garden, while lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. Not the cruel youth who had rejected her, but the broken man who had knelt in the gravel and confessed 20 years of regret, with tears streaming down his face. She thought of the loneliness in his eyes, the self-awareness in his letters, the quiet persistence that never demanded but simply existed, patient and unwavering. "I want nothing to do with him," Eleanor said firmly, as much to convince herself as to reassure her friend. "I have built a good life without him, and I will not compromise my peace for a man who once found me so thoroughly unsuitable he humiliated me before all of society." But even as she spoke the words, she felt their hollowness, felt the way her heart refused to align with her rational mind, and she recognized with growing alarm that her walls were beginning to crack despite her best efforts to fortify them. December brought frost to London and drove Eleanor indoors more frequently, seeking warmth in the places that had always provided sanctuary libraries, museums, and most particularly Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, where she had spent countless afternoons over the years, browsing shelves that felt more like home than many actual houses she had visited. She was examining a newly arrived volume of Goethe when she sensed a presence behind her and turned to find Alexander Ashford standing 3 feet away, looking as surprised to see her as she was to see him. For a moment they simply stared at each other, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed defenses rising instinctively, preparing for whatever careful pursuit might follow. But Alexander made no move toward her, did not smile with presumption or speak with the confidence of someone who had engineered this encounter. Instead, he looked genuinely uncertain, caught between the desire to acknowledge her and the fear of intruding where he was not welcome. "Lady Ashworth," he said finally, his voice quiet and respectful, "forgive me. I did not mean to startle you." "You did not," Eleanor replied, surprised to find it was true. There was something different about encountering him here, in this neutral space, free from the weight of social obligation or the memory of gardens and confessions. Here, they were simply two people who happened to frequent the same bookshop, nothing more. She glanced at the volume in his hand, Kant's Critique of Practical Reason, and felt her eyebrows rise slightly. "Heavy reading for a winter afternoon," she observed before she could stop herself. Alexander looked down at the book as though he had forgotten he held it, then back at her with something that might have been self-deprecation. "I find I have rather a lot of time for contemplation these days, and Kant's perspective on moral duty has become relevant to my current considerations." There was no self-pity in his tone, no attempt to manipulate her sympathy, simply a statement of fact, delivered with the weariness of someone who had been wrestling with difficult questions for longer than was comfortable. Eleanor found herself responding despite her better judgment. "I prefer Marcus Aurelius for such matters. Less abstraction, more practical wisdom about bearing the consequences of one's choices." "I read your recommended translation," Alexander said, and then, seeing her confusion, added quickly, "I apologize, I mentioned it in one of my letters. I should not presume you read them." "I did read them," Eleanor admitted, the words escaping before she could consider their implications. They were thoughtful. Something shifted in his expression, not triumph, but a kind of humble gratitude that made him look younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "I am glad," he said simply. What followed was the strangest half-hour Eleanor had experienced in recent memory. They drifted through the bookshop together, not quite walking side by side, but not quite separate, discussing literature and philosophy with the ease of long acquaintance. Alexander's knowledge surprised her. He was well-read, thoughtful, capable of engaging with complex ideas without the need to dominate or impress. He listened when she spoke, asked questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite performance, and disagreed with her interpretation of Wordsworth with arguments that were intelligent and respectful rather than dismissive. She found herself laughing at an observation he made about the pretensions of certain contemporary poets, the sound surprising them both. This was not the cold, arrogant duke of her memory, nor even the broken supplicant from the garden. This was someone she had never known existed, a man of substance and thought, someone she might have actually enjoyed knowing under different circumstances. When they finally parted on the street outside, the winter sun already setting behind the buildings, Eleanor felt profoundly unsettled. She had enjoyed his company. More than enjoyed it, she had felt intellectually stimulated, genuinely engaged, almost reluctant for the conversation to end, and that realization terrified her more than any amount of pursuit ever could. The letter arrived 3 days after their encounter at Hatchard's, and Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately, that careful, elegant script that had become familiar over the past weeks of unopened and eventually opened correspondence. This time, however, she broke the seal without hesitation, curiosity overcoming caution, and found not another gentle philosophical musing, but a direct engagement with the disagreement they had begun about Wordsworth's treatment of nature versus human emotion. Alexander argued his position with more detail than their brief conversation had allowed, cited specific passages, and then most dangerously asked for her thoughts, genuinely requested her perspective, as though her opinion mattered to him, as though he truly wished to understand her interpretation rather than simply assert his own. Eleanor told herself she would not respond. She set the letter aside, went about her day, attended to correspondence with her charities, reviewed accounts, took her afternoon walk through the frost-touched gardens. But that evening, as darkness fell early and winter settled over the countryside like a held breath, she found herself at her writing desk with pen in hand, composing a response that began with literature and somehow wandered into broader questions of how we reconcile our interior lives with the world's demands upon us. She sent it before she could reconsider, and his reply came within days. What developed over the following weeks was unlike any correspondence Eleanor had maintained before, not the careful social exchanges she conducted with other acquaintances, nor the practical communications required by her charitable work, but something deeper and more dangerous. They wrote of books and ideas, yes, but the discussions became vehicles for revealing themselves to each other in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Alexander wrote about his isolation, the loneliness of a position that demanded performance over authenticity, the realization that he had built his entire life around external validation rather than internal truth. He wrote of his marriage with painful honesty, not to elicit sympathy, but to examine his own failures, to understand how he had mistaken propriety for connection and status for worth. Eleanor found herself responding with equal honesty, writing about her own journey from devastation to self-construction, about the ways pain had forced her to discover strengths she might never have known she possessed. She wrote about the loneliness of her choice to remain unmarried, not because no one had asked, several had, over the years, but because she had learned to value peace over passion, and none of the men who sought her hand had offered anything that seemed worth risking her hard-won equilibrium. The winter deepened, and their letters became more frequent, arriving twice weekly, then 3 times, until Eleanor found herself anticipating the post with an eagerness she had not felt in years. She began to notice details about him she had missed before: his self-deprecating humor, his genuine curiosity about her opinions, the way he never presumed intimacy, but allowed it to develop naturally through accumulated exchanges. He asked about her work with the school, listened through the medium of written words with what felt like genuine interest, and offered observations that were helpful rather than patronizing. Most dangerous of all, she found herself wanting to share things with him, wanting to know his thoughts on matters both profound and trivial, wanting to continue conversations that seemed to have no natural ending. The letter that arrived in mid-January was different from all the others, and Eleanor sensed it the moment she broke the seal. The handwriting was less controlled than usual, the script betraying an unsteadiness that spoke of emotions barely contained, and the opening lines confirmed what she had intuited. This was not an intellectual discussion or a philosophical musing, but something raw and unguarded, a confession offered without expectation of absolution. Alexander wrote of his marriage with a candor that made Eleanor's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. He described the wedding night when he and Catherine had stood in their separate chambers, knowing they were strangers who would remain strangers, bound by law and duty but separated by an unbridgeable gulf of indifference. He wrote of years spent maintaining appearances while dying slowly inside, of conversations that never progressed beyond the superficial, of a profound loneliness that somehow felt worse than solitude because it was loneliness experienced in constant proximity to another human being. He wrote of lying awake at night beside a woman he did not love and who did not love him, both of them imprisoned in arrangement that benefited everyone except the 2 people actually living it. But it was what came next that broke something open in Eleanor's carefully guarded heart. He wrote of the specific moment, 5 years into his marriage, when he had seen a young couple at an assembly newly wed, gazing at each other with obvious affection, and had felt such crushing regret that he had to leave the room. He had realized then, with devastating clarity, that he had rejected the possibility of genuine feeling in favor of strategic advantage. It had destroyed any chance at real connection, because he had been too proud and too foolish to recognize that Eleanor Hastings, nervous and modestly dowered though she was, might have been capable of offering him something his brilliant match never could: authentic affection, intellectual companionship, a partnership built on mutual regard rather than mutual obligation. "I destroyed my own life when I rejected you," he wrote, the words stark on the page. "I see that now with a clarity that makes the past 20 years feel like a prison sentence I imposed upon myself. I do not write this to burden you with my regrets, or to suggest that you bear any responsibility for my misery. You do not. The fault was entirely mine, the cruelty was entirely mine, and the consequences have been entirely mine to bear. But I wanted you to know that you were not found wanting, Eleanor. I was. You were never unsuitable. I was unsuitable for you, unsuitable for any genuine human connection, so corrupted by pride and prejudice that I could not recognize treasure when it stood before me, hoping I might be kind." He did not ask her to forgive him again, did not request her sympathy or understanding, did not suggest that his suffering entitled him to anything from her. He simply laid his truth before her, like an offering with no expectation of acceptance, and then concluded with words that Eleanor read 3 times, each reading striking deeper than the last. "I do not expect or deserve your compassion. I simply wanted you to know that the mistake was mine, not yours, and that you have spent these years becoming someone remarkable, while I have spent them recognizing what a fool I was." Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time as winter light faded from her study and shadows gathered in the corners. She felt tears on her cheeks without quite knowing when they had begun, moved by a pain that was not her own, but that she could now finally understand. Alexander Ashford was not a villain who had casually destroyed her and moved on without consequence. He was a flawed, suffering human being who had made a terrible choice and spent 2 decades living in its wreckage. And somehow that knowledge changed everything. February melted into March, and what had begun as an accidental encounter at a bookshop had somehow transformed into something that resembled, if Eleanor was being honest with herself, a courtship conducted with such propriety and patience that it almost disguised its own nature. They met perhaps once a week, always in public settings at galleries, lectures, charity events, once at a concert where they sat in adjacent boxes and exchanged glances during particularly moving passages. Alexander never presumed, never pushed, never suggested anything that might compromise her reputation or comfort, and yet his presence had become a constant in her life, something she found herself anticipating with an eagerness that both thrilled and alarmed her. Their conversations had evolved beyond the intellectual sparring of their letters into something more comfortable, more natural. They could discuss serious matters with the depth their correspondence had established, but they could also share observations about the absurdities of social conventions, laugh together at the pretensions of mutual acquaintances, fall into companionable silences that required no filling. Eleanor discovered that Alexander possessed a dry wit she had never suspected, a capacity for self-mockery that suggested genuine humility rather than false modesty. When he recounted a disastrous attempt to personally oversee repairs at one of his tenant farms, resulting in a collapsed fence and 3 escaped sheep, his telling was so genuinely funny and self-deprecating that Eleanor had laughed, until tears gathered in her eyes, and the warmth in his expression as he watched her laugh had made her heart perform a dangerous flutter. There were small moments that accumulated like snow, each one insignificant alone, but together creating something substantial and transformative. The way his face lit when he saw her enter a room, as though her presence was a gift he had not quite expected. The careful attention he paid to her comfort, appearing at her elbow with refreshment before she realized she wanted it, offering his arm when the ground was uneven without making her feel fragile or incapable. The earnest passion in his voice when he discussed a book that had moved him, the vulnerability in his willingness to share his genuine reactions rather than performing sophistication. The way he remembered details from their conversations, asking after a particular charity project she had mentioned weeks earlier, bringing her a pamphlet about educational reform because she had expressed interest in the subject, noticing when she was tired or troubled, and not pressing for explanations she was not ready to give. It was during a walk through Hyde Park on an unexpectedly warm afternoon in late March that Eleanor realized, with a jolt of recognition that felt almost like fear, that she was developing feelings for him. They had been discussing something inconsequential, the merits of various approaches to garden design, when Alexander had stopped to examine a particularly early blooming daffodil, his expression softening with such simple pleasure at the harbinger of spring that Eleanor had felt something crack open in her chest. She was falling in love with him, not with the idea of him, not with some fantasy of redemption or second chances, but with the actual man he had become, thoughtful, humble, capable of genuine growth and change. The realization terrified her absolutely, because it meant risking everything she had built, all the safety and peace she had cultivated over 20 years of careful self-protection. She had sworn she would never again give anyone the power to hurt her, as Alexander had once hurt her, and yet here she stood, her heart opening despite every rational argument against it, feeling herself drawn toward a man who had once found her so unsuitable he had destroyed her in front of all society. The withdrawal was not dramatic or announced, but Alexander felt it as keenly as if Eleanor had drawn a blade across the fragile connection they had built. She stopped responding to his letters with her previous promptness, her replies becoming brief and distant when they came at all. When they encountered each other at social events, and he suspected she had begun avoiding gatherings she knew he might attend, she was cordial but contained, her walls rebuilt with such swift efficiency that he marveled at how thoroughly she could shut him out. He understood, with painful clarity, what had happened. She had realized she was developing feelings, and the prospect had terrified her into retreat. He could not blame her. He had given her every reason to fear vulnerability, had demonstrated through his past cruelty exactly how devastating it was to offer one's heart to someone who might reject it. That she had begun to soften toward him at all was more than he deserved, and he would not compound his past sins by pressuring her or refusing to respect her clear desire for distance. But the loss of her, the loss of those conversations and shared moments, and the growing warmth between them, hollowed him out in ways that made his previous loneliness seem trivial by comparison. He had been alone before, yes, but he had not known what he was missing. Now he did, and the knowledge was a form of exquisite torment. 2 weeks after her withdrawal became unmistakable, Alexander sat down at his desk as evening gathered and wrote what he knew must be his final letter. His hand shook as he formed the words, but he forced himself to continue, to offer her this last truth before he released her entirely. "My dearest Eleanor," he began, using the endearment for the first time, knowing he would never have another opportunity. "I have noticed your withdrawal, and I respect it absolutely. I will not pursue you further, will not intrude upon your peace, will absent myself from events where my presence might cause you discomfort. You have given me far more than I deserved in allowing our friendship to develop as it did, and I will not repay your generosity by refusing to honor your clear wish for distance. But before I retreat into the silence you require, I must tell you one truth, not because I expect anything from you, but because you deserve to know it. I love you. I love you with a depth and certainty that I have never felt for anyone, that I did not know I was capable of feeling. I love your intelligence, your kindness, your strength, your dignity, your capacity for forgiveness that exceeds anything I could have imagined. I love the way you move through the world, making it better by your presence, the way you care for others without expectation of recognition, the way you have transformed pain into purpose and emerged from devastation as someone truly remarkable. I know I have no right to love you. I know that my past cruelty forfeited any claim I might have had to your affection. I know that offering you my love is perhaps itself a kind of burden you did not ask to carry. But I wanted you to know that you are the finest person I have ever known, and that loving you, even hopelessly, even from a distance, has made me better than I was. I will trouble you no more. Be happy, Eleanor. You deserve every happiness this world can offer, and I hope you find it." He sealed the letter with hands that trembled, sent it with a heart that was breaking, and prepared himself for a future that would contain her only as a beautiful might have been, forever out of reach. Spring arrived with sudden violence, winter releasing its grip all at once, so that the world seemed to burst into bloom overnight. Eleanor walked through her gardens, watching crocuses and daffodils push through earth that had been frozen just days before, and felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that mirrored the season's transformation, uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. She had been a coward. The realization came to her not with gentle insight, but with the sharp clarity of truth that could no longer be avoided. She had felt herself falling in love with Alexander Ashford, and had retreated immediately into the protective walls she had built 20 years ago, had let old fear dictate present choices, had treated him as though he was still the cruel youth who had rejected her rather than the changed man who had spent months demonstrating through every action that he had become someone different. His final letter lay in her desk drawer, read so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. She had wept over it, not tears of pain, but of recognition and loss, and a grief that was entirely self-imposed. He loved her. He had offered her his heart with no expectation of reciprocation, had promised to leave her in peace, and she had let him go because she was too frightened to risk being hurt again. But what was she protecting exactly? The life she had built was good, yes, but it was also limited, constrained by the very walls that had once been necessary for survival. She had transformed herself from the broken girl in the ballroom into a woman of substance and purpose, had learned her own worth and cultivated her own strength. But in doing so, had she also armored herself so thoroughly that she could no longer be touched by genuine feeling? Had she become so committed to safety that she had sacrificed the possibility of joy? The truth she had been avoiding settled over her with the weight of spring rain. Alexander had changed, yes, but more importantly, she had changed too. She was not the vulnerable 18-year-old who could be destroyed by rejection. She was a woman of 38 who had survived devastation and emerged stronger, who had built a life of meaning and learned that her worth was not determined by anyone's opinion of her. She was strong enough now to risk love, strong enough to survive even if it ended badly, strong enough to choose vulnerability not from weakness but from courage. And Alexander, the man she had come to know through months of letters and conversations, was not the arrogant duke of her memory. He had been humbled by regret, transformed by suffering, made genuinely better by recognizing his own failures. He had demonstrated patience and respect, had honored her boundaries, had offered her his love, and then stepped back when she indicated she needed space. He had become someone worthy of trust, and more than that, he had become someone she genuinely loved, not the fantasy of what he might have been, but the reality of who he had become. She thought of the broken man who had knelt before her in the garden, of the thoughtful correspondent who had engaged her mind and honored her opinions, of the companion who had made her laugh and think and feel alive in ways she had not experienced in 20 years. She thought of his final letter, that generous offering of love without demands, that wish for her happiness even if it meant his own continued solitude. How could she have read those words and responded with silence? How could she have let fear prevent her from reaching for something that might be extraordinary simply because it carried the risk of pain? The decision once made was absolute. She would go to him. She would tell him that she had been frightened and foolish, that she needed time, but was willing now to take the risk he had been patiently waiting for her to take. She would choose courage over safety, possibility over protection, love over loneliness. Mrs. Hartley found her in the garden, her expression determined in a way the older woman had not seen in months. "I am going to Ravensmere Hall," Eleanor said before her companion could speak. "Today, now, I have been hiding from happiness, and I will not do it any more." Mrs. Hartley studied her for a long moment, then smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly this declaration. "Then let us call for the carriage," she said simply, "and let us not waste another moment." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Ravensmere Hall as Eleanor was shown into the grand entrance, her heart beating with a rhythm that was part fear and part exhilaration. The butler looked startled by her unannounced arrival, but was too well trained to comment, simply informing her that His Grace was in his study and asking if she wished to be announced. Eleanor shook her head. This conversation required no formal preamble, no careful staging. She needed to see him, to speak to him, before courage could desert her. She found him at his desk, surrounded by papers he was clearly not reading, staring out the window at gardens bursting with spring bloom he did not seem to see. He looked diminished somehow, as though grief had carved away something essential, leaving behind a man who was going through the motions of existence without truly inhabiting his life. There was silver at his temples that had not been there months ago, lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and joyless days. When he sensed her presence and turned, the sequence of emotions that crossed his face, shock, hope, fear of hope, nearly broke her heart. "Eleanor," he breathed, rising so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "What? Why are you—" "I was wrong," she said, the words tumbling out before he could finish. "I was wrong to shut you out, wrong to let fear dictate my choices, wrong to treat you as though you were still the man who hurt me 20 years ago, rather than the man you have become. I was a coward, Alexander, and I am sorry." He stood frozen, as though afraid that movement might shatter whatever impossible reality had brought her to his door. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said hoarsely. "Nothing. I gave you every reason to fear, and you gave me every reason to trust," Eleanor interrupted, moving further into the room, closing the distance between them with steps that felt like the bravest thing she had ever done. "You have been patient and respectful and honest. You have demonstrated through months of consistent action that you are no longer the arrogant boy who valued status over substance. You have changed, Alexander, but more importantly, I have changed too. I am strong enough now to risk this, to choose possibility over safety, to acknowledge that I love you and want to see where that love might lead." The words hung in the air between them, and she watched his face transform disbelief, giving way to wonder, giving way to a joy so profound it made him look younger, as though years of accumulated sorrow were lifting all at once. "You love me?" he whispered, as though testing the reality of the words. "I love you," Eleanor confirmed, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones, solid and certain. "Not the idea of you, not some fantasy of redemption, but you, the real, flawed, genuine person you have allowed me to know." What followed was the conversation they should have had 20 years ago, the honest exchange that might have changed everything, if they had both been capable of it then. They spoke of fear, hers of being hurt again, his of being forever unworthy of forgiveness. They spoke of the nature of genuine transformation, of how people could change when they truly confronted their own failures rather than rationalizing them away. They spoke of second chances and whether such things were earned or given, and concluded that perhaps they were both offered as grace but proven through sustained effort and time. Alexander reached for her hands, holding them as though they were precious and fragile. "Eleanor," he said, his voice shaking slightly, might you allow me to court you, properly, openly, with all the patience and care I should have shown you from the beginning? I know I have no right to ask, but—" "Yes," Eleanor said simply, and watched his face flood with such relief and happiness that she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had made the right choice. 2 years had passed since that spring afternoon when Eleanor walked into Alexander's study and chose courage over fear, and the life they had built together bore no resemblance to the cold, dutiful marriage he had endured before or the solitary existence she had cultivated in self-protection. They had married quietly 6 months after their reconciliation, a small ceremony attended by close friends who witnessed not youthful passion, but something deeper and more enduring. A love built on genuine knowledge of each other, on hard-won trust and mutual respect, on the understanding that came from both having suffered and grown and chosen each other with full awareness of human fallibility. Their days were filled with the ordinary magic of true partnership, mornings spent reading in companionable silence, afternoons working together on the charitable causes that mattered to them both, and evenings discussing everything from philosophy to the mundane details of estate management with equal engagement. They had established a school on Alexander's property, combining Eleanor's educational vision with his resources, and took profound satisfaction in watching daughters of impoverished families receive opportunities that might transform their futures. They disagreed sometimes. Certainly 2 strong-willed, intelligent people could hardly do otherwise, but they had learned to argue with respect, to listen as carefully as they spoke, and to remember that they were partners rather than opponents. Alexander had discovered that Eleanor's strength, far from threatening his masculinity, enhanced his own capacity for growth, and Eleanor had learned that vulnerability in the presence of someone trustworthy was not weakness but courage. On a September evening, as autumn began its slow transformation of the landscape, they sat together in the garden at Ravensmere Hall, watching the sun set over grounds that had once witnessed Eleanor's humiliation but now held only peace. Alexander reached for her hand, and she gave it willingly, marveling at how something as simple as touch could contain such depths of feeling: gratitude, affection, desire, and the profound comfort of being truly known and truly loved. "I do not deserve you," Alexander said quietly, a sentiment he expressed occasionally despite her protests. "You deserve me," Eleanor corrected gently, as she always did, "because I chose you, knowing everything, and you have spent every day since proving that my choice was right." They sat in silence as darkness gathered, 2 people who had found their way to each other through the long route of pain and regret and patient transformation, and both understood that what they had was more valuable for having been so nearly lost. Dear listener, if you have stayed with us through this long tale of heartbreak and redemption, perhaps you recognize something of yourself in Eleanor or Alexander: the fear of risking your heart again after it has been broken, the burden of regrets that seem too heavy to bear, the question of whether people truly can change or whether past cruelty forever defines us. Know this: second chances exist not as erasure of the past, but as opportunities to meet it with wisdom earned through suffering. Forgiveness, when genuine, frees both the forgiver and the forgiven to become something better than they were. And love, when truly earned through patience and demonstrated change, when built on foundation of genuine respect and understanding rather than illusion and convenience, is worth every moment of the wait, every risk of the vulnerable heart. May you find the courage to forgive what needs forgiving, to change what needs changing, and to risk your heart when someone proves themselves worthy of the gift. May you discover that strength and vulnerability are not opposites but companions, and that the most profound connections are often those rebuilt from ruins with care and time and honest effort. May you know peace, dear listener, and may you rest well. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that redemption is possible, that love can be found even in the most unlikely places, and that it is never too late to become the person you were meant to be.